Hello, I'm Dr. Jane McCartney. I'm a consultant psychologist in the UK. I'm fascinated by human behaviour, but particularly all things crime. In today's episode, I wanted to look at the case of Harold Shipman, also known as Dr. Death. Ultimately, when they would do an inquiry into his activities, he was credited with possibly 236 murders. It could have been slightly more, it could have been slightly less, but that makes him the most prolific serial killer in history. Before I start, if I could ask you please to like, subscribe, and make any comments below. It's always interesting to read. So what I'm going to do is look at the background of Shipman, look at the timeline of his career and his crimes. I'm going to look at the personality facets of Harold Shipman, and then I'm going to offer my analysis. Now remember, I'm not diagnosing anybody, I'm just speculating. Harold Frederick Shipman was born in 1946 to a working class family in Nottinghamshire in England. His mother, who from what I could gather was a fairly domineering character and a big character in his life, would die of lung cancer when he was 17. And it was said that he was fascinated by the effects of the morphine drugs that she was taking towards the end of her life. He was absolutely fascinated by the quickness and the effect that they would have on her. And it was said later on that perhaps he was trying to recreate that, but I'll look at that a little bit more in my analysis later on. He would go to medical school. He was a bright child. He passed his 11 plus, so he would and went to grammar school. He would go to medical school. He passed on the first entrance exam, but studying hard, he got in the second time. He would go to medical school. In the meantime, he would meet and marry his future wife. They got married when he was 1920. She was 17 and 5 months pregnant. They would go on to have 4 more children. And it was a long and happy marriage from what I can gather. When he qualified, he spent a couple of years, as often newly qualified doctors will do, junior doctors will do, working in the local hospital. But after about 4 years, he went into general practice. He became a GP. And it was in 1974, when he was working at one of his first practices, that he was found to have been fraudulently obtaining pethidine. And he had become a pethidine addict. He was getting the scripts written up for himself, and he was using the drug himself. He was caught by a colleague. He would say to this colleague he was just fascinated by the effects of drugs. He said that when he was studying at med school, this was particularly so. But there's obviously that link into his past with his mother as well that seems to be coming out there. He was fined. He was taken to court. He was sacked. He was fined. He wasn't given any disciplinary action by the Doctors Association in the UK, and he went for a brief stint to a drug rehab program. After he came out, after a seemingly short time, he would find work again as a general practitioner within another couple of practices in the northern area, around the Manchester area, is where he tended to work. And in 1993, falling out with his partners. Now, he had a reputation all the time that he was practicing within a large partnership or even a small partnership, but with other doctors and other staff. He had a reputation of being very aloof and superior and dismissive and haughty with some staff and some partners and some patients, but not all. And that's an interesting facet of his personality, again, which I'll analyse later, but kind of just mark that one. So in 1993, having finally fallen out with his last partnership, he started on his own. And when he started in Hyde in Greater Manchester. A lot of his original patients from the doctor's practice that he was at, that he'd left, would come with him. And they came with him because, to him, he was a really good doctor. In 1998, the death of a Mrs. Grundy started to raise concerns. Her daughter would not accept that, one, that her mother was the person that Shipman was making her out to be, which was basically a drug addict, and also that the will that her mother had made was completely false. And it would turn out at the court hearing of Shipman when it was analysed by a handwriting expert, that it wasn't anything, this will that had been written and signed bore no relationship to the handwriting of her mother. And in it, she had purported to have left everything to Shipman, and also had written in there that he was such a good doctor and he was so kind to all of his patients, which seemed just that over an extra bit. It was a number of things that would raise the concerns of Mrs. Grundy's daughter. And ultimately, a rare event in this country, but ultimately the permission was given to exhume her body. And when a toxicology report was done, a pathology report was done, it was found that she had died of an overdose of morphine, which didn't fit with her mother's records. Shipman would attempt occasionally to alter the medical records of his patients. And he didn't realise, and again, this would come out in the court as evidence against him, he didn't realise that every time that he would go back, and he would often alter the records after the patient had died, and he was altering them to fit the cause of death that he was talking about. But he didn't realise that the computer was time-stamping them. So this case with Mrs. Grundy started raising the concerns, but also rumours and concerns had started to be raised just before that. A local undertaker had spoken to Shipman, saying that he had a disproportionately high death rate of elderly people who would die in the afternoon or in early evening when Shipman was doing his house calls. They were often sitting upright or lying on the settee, and they were dressed, and this was highly, highly unusual. And the undertaker raised his concerns with Shipman, and he was kind of easy. I don't know how easily allayed he was, but he was certainly allayed by Shipman. And the other person that was making note of what was going on with Shipman was a local doctor, because you have to have the death certificate countersigned. And Shipman would go to a local practice, not one that he'd worked for before, but to get this countersigned. And a doctor there that he kept going to just countersign for him was realising that there were just far too many death certificates. Again, it was disproportionately high for the area, the cohort, the demographic. It was just too high. So she raised her concerns with the local coroner, who was then duty bound to inform the police. And that's when they started looking into Shipman's activities. He was arrested and taken in for questioning at his interview and also at his subsequent trial, which was in January 2000. He was aloof and superior. He was dismissive of the facts when they were presented to him. And this was his complete character. He was found guilty. He was sentenced to 15 life sentences. Now, they could only charge him with 15 counts of murder because those were the bodies that they were able to exhume and test for an overdose of morphine, because Shipman apparently was very keen to have his patients who had died cremated, and generally the families would go along with that. There was talk as well afterwards when some of the families would say, when their loved ones were reaching the end of their life, and Shipman would say, I'll call an ambulance because this is the time we need to get some extra help for this person. I'll call them because as a doctor they'll come quicker. And when that person would then die, because he knew when they were going to die more or less, he would then say, I'll cancel the ambulance so it can then go on to somebody else. And records would show that this just wasn't true. He never called the ambulance. He never called the emergency services at all. So those were Shipman's crimes. He was sentenced to 15 life sentences, which was basically he was going to spend the rest of his life in prison. And 4 years later, when he had assured and got his paperwork and his life assurance and his NHS pension, which is a fairly substantial pension, in order, he then killed himself. He hung himself with some bed sheets inside his prison. He wasn't on a suicide watch. He didn't present as a prisoner he'd been in jail for 4 years. He didn't present as a prisoner of particularly high risk. So this is what he was able to do. There was a bit of an outcry at the time as to why his wife should be benefiting by his pension. But ultimately, that was the law at the time, and that's what he was able to do. There is no suggestion at all that his wife Primrose knew anything of his crimes or benefited from his actual crimes. Although when the police raided his home, they found lots of items that didn't belong to him. They belonged to his former patients. And the family of the patients would say that after the person had died, he would often say, "Oh, your mother, father had said I was to have a painting, a particular piece of artwork, a vase, or jewellery." And apparently, if they didn't say, "Oh yes, of course, if this is what mum and dad wanted, you must have it," if they didn't agree with that, apparently he would just take it anyway. And lots of items that didn't belong to him were found at the family home. So how he passed those off to his family, I don't know. I have no idea. So if we now look at the personality of Shipman, and I'm going to use the five-factor model, and if we think of his openness to new experiences, that was pretty low. He kept his little kind of world exactly how he wanted it. It was working and forming and going along exactly how he wanted it to. So he wasn't particularly open to new experiences. From a point of view of conscientiousness, no, it's not very conscientious to go and murder 236 people. But from the point of view of his persistence and his motivation and his determination to do these things to other people and get what he wanted from them, that puts him at a fairly high level of conscientiousness. Extrovertism, he was pretty low. He just trundled along his particular path that he wanted to. And if he met some kind of resistance, like working with other GPs and partners and staff, he would just go his own way. And that's ultimately what he would do. These days in the UK, solo GPs are not allowed to work. There is no such thing as a solo GP. You have to be in partnership with another GP, purely as the legacy of Shipman. And it's such a shame because there are many, many good GPs that ended up not working anymore because through whatever choice, they enjoyed working by themselves and they worked very well and conscientiously and did the best for their patients. But because of Shipman, they weren't allowed to do that anymore. So a lot of GPs sadly stopped working. A lot of good GPs sadly stopped working. Agreeableness, he's low, medium, low. Again, agreeableness is a scale. And on the one hand, you have being very agreeable. On the other hand, you have being very disagreeable. And when he needed to be, such as getting a counter-signature for a death certificate, he could be very agreeable. And when, and talking to the undertaker that was raising concerns, he could be very agreeable. And when he was being interviewed by the police, say, for instance, he was being very disagreeable. He was being arrogant, he was being haughty, he was being just superior. And that's how he came across apparently in the court, this sense of superiority that was potentially instilled with him to him from a younger age, from his mother. His mother was said to have just doted on him harshly or with firmness to make sure that he fulfilled his potential and got off the council estate in Nottinghamshire. But there was a sense of superiority right from the start. And that's when I've researched Shipman, that's the word that seems to come out a lot, this sense of superiority. And of course, if he's feeling superior, then he has to believe that there are other people that are inferior. And now, if we turn to my analysis about Shipman doing what he did, it kind of forms itself into three questions. Did he do what he did, overdosing all his elderly patients to kill them? Did he do that because he was recreating the trauma of his mother dying? I don't really buy that. He was interested into the effects of drugs on people. And ultimately, I think he liked to play God. He had a God complex. You know, some of his patients may have lived, some of his patients may have died. And I think it was at his belief that it was his behest as to when that happened. Another theory is that he was jealous. It was the elderly that he targeted because he was jealous. They had all got old, whereas his beloved mother hadn't. So he was jealous of them and therefore he was punishing them. Again, I think that's probably looking too much into it. I just believe that the people that he targeted were, one, easy to manipulate. They were potentially coming to the end of their lives anyway, so there weren't going to be too many questions. And also the greed factor, that he was able to get hold of some of their property, some of their valuables, and he was convicted of one account of forgery, the will of Mrs. Grundy, but heaven knows how many others there may have been. And it may have been all very unofficial as well. They may not have been an actual will that went to probate or anything like that. It may have all been very unofficial. So he was certainly benefiting from his crimes. And the last theory that sometimes has been bandied about with Shipman was he addicted to killing? I don't think he was addicted to killing. I think, as I said before, he was just addicted to the control and the power of you will live and you will die, and it will all be at my say so when you do this. And that, as seen with his death, carried on to him. It was at his say so when he died. He was off any potential suicide watch, or he was seemingly getting on, not exactly a model prisoner, but he was getting on well within the prison system. So he just wasn't on the radar of somebody that was going to harm himself. And that was at his behest. So that's what he must have always thought. Again, he had to get all of his paperwork and his pension sorted out. So those are my thoughts on Harold Shipman. If I could ask you please to like and subscribe and put some comments below, it really helps the channel enormously when people do. So that'd be really great. I hope you've enjoyed my analysis, and I'll be along again soon with another Psychology of Crime. And until then, keep safe and thanks very much and goodbye.